Welcome back to another episode of Acceptable Chess and the weekly roundup for the Autumn Classic. As always, I'm your host, John Harden, here with National Master Andrew Hoy, live and in person, our favorite way to do the show. And we are going to take some time to look back, celebrate our successes, lament our mistakes, and learn how to do it better next week. Andrew, where do things stand as we are coming to the end of now round 4 and looking ahead to the final 2 matches of the tournament?
So we have 2 clear leaders at this point. Rufus and Alex have broken a point clear of the field, so I think it's safe to say that one of them will probably win the tournament, and they will certainly play this upcoming week, so we will be watching for that game with great anticipation.
Ooh, this is probably an awkward time to announce that they were both a little rude to me, so I'm forfeiting both of them this week.
Nice. Throwing the standings back into chaos.
What can I say? I like a little bit of mystery in my final 2 rounds.
Looking further down the table, though, we have a large race for 3rd to 4th, 5th, 6th places. So that should be interesting to follow as well, especially because between Rufus and Alex, depending on what happens, we could really have somebody with a clear lead heading into round 6 and everything up in the air below that.
Yeah, and I think even if there is a decisive result in this round 5 game, that player will still have to win out to avoid sharing the lead with somebody else. So it's still going to stay competitive. Should be an interesting last 2 weeks. And I'm really excited to see what happens.
Yeah.
But moving ahead, Andrew, you and I have been talking this week, and we decided that we wanted to do something a little bit different with topics and trends. We've covered a lot of ground in this way of dealing with the show. What is it that we've done this week, and why?
Yeah, so instead of talking about specific things to try and look for, we want to talk about when to look for those things. So really identifying these critical moments when you have to spend a little bit more time and really bear down and find the correct move.
Now, you say critical moments, and that sounds certainly important, but I have to say that I've had a lot of confusion about what critical moments are. I mean, there are even books that are titled Critical Moments that I own one, and it never actually defines clearly what a critical moment is. So, what is this thing, critical moment?
I think the simplest way to explain it is a critical moment is when you have to calculate and spend your time. It's not always clear when you're at a critical moment, but there are a couple of things that we can look for that are kind of warning signs, if you will, that suggest that this might be a critical moment. So to that end, the 3 things that we want to point out are when pieces are traded, especially when it's an unequal trade, so a knight for a bishop or giving up an exchange or a piece for 3 pawns. Anytime the pawn structure itself changes, because the plans are going to be different after the pawn structure changes, and then when the queens are traded especially, or when we're transitioning to an endgame in general, because that becomes very concrete, and one side is almost certainly going to be better or worse after the queens come off the board.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that information. I noticed that my student Tristan has been spotted in the chat. Hey, Tristan, thanks for making it out to the show. But let's carry forward and get a look at our game, shall we?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I wanted to start with this first... with this game first. This is between Solal and Tyler, where Tyler, spoiler alert, gets his first win of this tournament and last tournament. So congratulations, Tyler. I was too excited. I had to ruin it off the jump. So in this game, I think we have a fairly typical opening in the beginning. I'm not... I suppose I'm fine with bishop e6. I think probably white needs to take immediately in order to preserve any chance at an advantage. You can end up in a little bit of trouble here. Maybe the king is open a little early, but on the other hand, black does have maybe an extra pawn in the center, so if white is not precise, I think it's playable. But certainly after bishop to e2, I think white comes to some disadvantage. But the game gets pretty messy after that. Tyler immediately tries to play aggressively back and take advantage of this little bit of putting white on his back foot, which I really like. But after that, I think we find ourselves in a little bit of a chaotic position. Black manages to fork 2 pieces, right, go up some material, but then we have kind of a crazy set of exchanges where it looks like at some moment we probably could have gone up with a massive advantage for white. I actually confess I have not spent time to suss this out, but I think both sides were making some assumptions here. In this moment...
I think when the bishop was on g4, white could have captured on g4 and been okay.
Right, yeah, just taken twice here, right, and he makes up for the loss of material here.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we end up in a little bit of a chaotic position, but white has actually managed to clarify things to his benefit, because now, of course, the problem with playing a move like f5 is you open your king, and so suddenly we realize that bad things are happening on the light squares. So Solal, playing good heads-up chess, takes advantage of that. Tyler is able to defend with queen f7, and I would say that we are looking forward to a really interesting game here. I think that white can take. White has a really cool move of knight to e4, where if black attempts to win a queen, white can play this clever move of knight to f6 and get his material back. And white, I think, is doing well, but black is not without options. Unfortunately, Solal had a bit of an unfortunate moment here. He played queen to g4 and dropped the entire queen, and the game wrapped up very quickly. So it had a really promising beginning. I'd love to see more of this kind of play out of Solal. It's just a bad luck thing, and it's happened to a few people this tournament.
Yeah, I think most recently to Tyler. The shoe was on the other foot. So it's one of those things where it goes around, comes around, and hopefully we all can pay more attention and keep our queens on the board.
I wasn't going to say it, Ty. I wasn't going to say it. He's a madman.
All right, so let's look at our next game. This was between Andrew and Chris, and this was another interesting game. It was a very back-and-forth game. So if we look at the opening, it kind of gets a little bit messy right off the bat. F3 is a way to play against the French, but usually you're playing this after black has taken on e4 and you're sacrificing a pawn with f3. It doesn't make as much sense to play it this prematurely. Black correctly opens the position, and now after g4, this actually gives us a structure similar to fool's mate. Of course, fool's mate would be f3, e5, g4, and black plays checkmate on move 2, the fastest possible checkmate in chess.
Doesn't seem to recommend the position very much.
It really doesn't. After g4, we see a lot of similarities in that position. Queen h4 right away would allow bishop f2, so it's maybe not perfect right this second. But we see that already white has created all these dark square weaknesses, and they're going to permanently be dark square weaknesses in this position. Instead, black took on d4. I really like taking on d4. It forces the weakness of e5. And now black goes for the throat with bishop c5. We're going to trade off the only defender of the dark squares, and black should be much better right away.
Suddenly it occurs to me that these games, the first two games, have a little bit in common, right? White attacking on the light squares because of this f-pawn move, and now black attacking on the dark squares.
Yes. Yeah, so let's go through the next couple of moves. A knight c6 forcing this bishop off the board. Black defends it, but now white trades a bunch and is going to end up a clear pawn up by taking on e5. Not to mention that probably it would have been better to throw in queen h4 at some moment, but it's okay. It's fine to not play that when we're winning a center pawn like this. A few more moves, the knight moves back and forth, so black has now solidified the advantage. Here, white takes, so all of a sudden white's back in the game. White has his pawn back, white's queen is incredibly active, and black finds this very creative move, king e7, to connect the queen to the rook and defend that way. Unfortunately, now the king is stuck in the center, so even though we have this pawn shield in the center, I would say that black is clearly better. And after queen g8, white in the game played queen g5. If instead he had traded queens and played something like h3 or bishop f3 to hold on to this pawn, I'd say that white has a really clear advantage and should win without too much trouble.
Yeah, I just want to go back. I think you meant to say that white is clearly better in that earlier position.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Very good. And, well, just to double up on that, yes, I will say, as somebody who plays the French defense, I have too many times, more than I'd care to admit, ended up with my king in the middle, but up some of these key pawns, and I find that I routinely lose them back to pinning ideas. Particularly, imagine a rook coming to e1 and now knight to d5 becomes possible. This is a kind of thing that just seems very difficult to deal with, and often white is okay with having lost the early material.
Yeah, so those of you looking closely at the stream might notice that there's a 1 up here next to black's score. So obviously black came back in the game. Let's jump ahead to later in the game. Black has just played rook c8, and we see that there's this really dangerous threat on c2. White needs to deal with that immediately. I think the easiest way to deal with that is to play c3, and now this g-pawn is ready to go, and white should be able to close out the game without too much more effort. White has this passed g-pawn. He has a backup passed g-pawn if he loses the first one. It should be a really straightforward path to victory. Instead of c3, he played g7 right away, perhaps thinking he was about to make a queen. Now black has at least a perpetual here. I think if white does play king a1, there is nothing more than a perpetual, and probably we would agree to a draw in not too many more moves. Unfortunately, one more mistake, king c1, and it hangs mate in 1, so black was able to win the game.
I spoke to Andrew after this game, Andrew who played, not the Andrew in front of me, and he said that he did in fact see the idea of rook takes c2. He was not blind to this, but it was a failure of evaluation. He didn't understand how bad it was going to be. So, yeah. Something to carry forward.
As a nice little mnemonic to kind of keep it straight, 2 rooks on the 7th are referred to as blind pigs because they devour everything in sight. However, they're blind. They can't see where they're going, so it's very hard for them to get mate unless white is a little bit complicit in the mating patterns.
Yeah, fell victim to an instruction book mate there.
Yes.
So, carrying forward, we'll look at something completely different, but, well, let's just say that we haven't given up on pushing this f-pawn. So this is between Dave and Lydia, and Dave made an offering with the white pieces of the King's Gambit, which is an entirely sound way to push your f-pawn and play very aggressively, usually to attack on a later open f-file. So, yes, very much f-pawn gaming. So Lydia plays an interesting response for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's a little bit less popular, this knight to c6 move, but also because we've seen it before. This move was played by Chip last week in his game against Rufus. Unfortunately, both players reached excellent positions and yet somehow failed to win. So this opening does not statistically seem to recommend itself, and yet this is why you have to watch the games. So Lydia plays this, I think, really well. Dave makes a very early mistake, probably due to an unusual move. He plays d4. This is an aggressive-looking move, but unfortunately, because of the knight and the pawn, it simply hangs a whole pawn. Now, you're playing the King's Gambit. Giving up a whole pawn is part of the deal. Why is this such a big problem? I think we see very, very quickly why, because of precise play by Lydia. After bishop c4, perfectly good move. Bishop b4 check is really annoying. White doesn't have a way to deal with this check that doesn't involve some amount of awkwardness. I'm not very happy about blocking with pieces that I don't really want to be exchanged, but the plan that Dave went for in the game, which is to play c3 and then take, allows now this bishop to come to life with a nice pin, and kind of inconvenience White's opening plan. I will say I don't love taking right away. I think you can always take later, and probably just something that's simple and developing, like knight to f6 and getting ready to castle would have been better, but you can see why Lydia was tempted. It ruins White's pawns and trades off a dangerous attacking piece in the future. So I think Black is doing very well. We see the thematic break come in this position of d5. One thing I want to note for Dave here, it's something you have to watch out for. This is a very impressive looking battery with the queen on b3 and the bishop on c4, but if there are no checks, as of course with the king safely castled away there are not, you can always fall victim to this move, knight to a5. Now, I think Lydia can play it right away. She finds a perfectly good way to continue, which is d5, and then she hits him where it hurts. This means your bishop is coming off, which may not seem like much because it's a fair exchange, but you've already given up a fair amount of material in order to get to this place. You really wanted to have an attack, and this move is saying no way. So really, after this, Black is doing extremely well, and I'm actually going to jump ahead, just as we did before, to a later position so we can see why and how things unraveled. So, we get to around move 25. Lydia's done very well. She's continued to consolidate. White's pawns are all over the place, and I think she's got excellent winning chances here. She finds the move knight to f2. This basically wins an exchange by force, because either the king will move and we'll take on d1, or, as happens in the game, we will sack the rook. But right now here, it is very important in this moment, a critical moment, if you will, to take with the queen. And Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you for a second. Why?
Yeah, I think the most simple reason is that the queen takes f2 line, puts the queen on its most active square. Black is threatening checkmates on g2 and h2, so that pretty much forces white to trade queens. And after the trade of queens, we're in an endgame where both of the f-pawns are weak, the h3 pawn is weak, and black can maybe come up with an annoying pin on the d-file if white doesn't move the bishop right away. So I think all of those things considered together, black is winning very, very easily, and there's no risk in the position.
I suddenly noticed a line that I think is really cute. Now, it involves white passing, which is a bit ridiculous, but I suddenly realized that after rook to d8, we can't even find the clever rook to e1, threatening checkmate, because we just take with the other rook.
Yes, yeah. And this is the type of thing that you'll see all the time if you can trade off queens when you're up a decisive amount of material. And this would have been the cleanest way to play. There's no risk, and Lydia should be able to close out the game in a few more moves.
Yeah, so a missed opportunity by her, but full credit to Dave, because I will say, the way that he plays the opening is pretty routinely chaotic. And I talk about this openly to Dave and to everyone else, right? He loves a mess. He does not mind it. But he plays this attack very well. So backing up here, after rook takes, rook to g1 immediately demonstrates the problems in black's position. We are threatening checkmate. f6 is a very useful move to try and take advantage of this pawn, which will of course be pinned, already is. And over the next few turns, we can see Lydia makes some very sensible moves to try and defuse the attack. I really like bishop f4 followed by bishop e5. And we can see Dave really, really cagily taking advantage of the dark squares, which are weakened after this move g6. This is already just about game over for black. She's going to lose material. Unfortunately, in the pressure, she managed to hang another rook, which...
Ooh.
In a lost position, I always say blunders don't come out of nowhere, right? They happen because of the pressure you're experiencing, but this really made it so that there was unfortunately no chance to come back, and Dave cleaned it up soon afterwards.
Nice game. A lot of fun.
Yeah, well played by both players, just unfortunately Dave played better in the second half.
Yeah. We have a couple of quick games that we want to take a look at now. The first one is between Danny and Alex. So this actually started as a London system, and we get to a critical moment almost right away. Here, h3 is a very normal move in the London system. The idea of h3 is to meet knight to h5 with bishop h2, so we don't have to cripple the pawn structure and allow black to trade a knight for the bishop. However, after bishop to d6, we are not as afraid of this exchange of bishop for bishop. So here we can play bishop d3 or bishop e2, and these are both normal moves. And the idea is that if black does take on f4, we've reinforced the e5 square with yet another pawn. And it's similar to the Pillsbury attack in the Queen's Gambit Declines. And it might be a little bit surprising that white is allowing both bishops to be traded off. But here, both bishops of black's are very strong. The bishop on f5 has been developed outside of the pawn chain, and the bishop on d6 is contesting white's best piece. So in this case, we're willing to trade off both of the bishops and transition into a game where we're just going to try and control e5.
That's really interesting, and I will say a good example of how important it is to understand what it is your opening's trying to accomplish. The London system, by putting this bishop on f4, is clearly making an offering of taking control of e5. So you can see how this actually ends up being really consistent, even though it looks wildly different and we've lost our London bishop.
Exactly, yeah. So I think this is kind of one of the things that we want to talk about and that we want people to take away, learning some of these common ideas in the opening so that you can file them away for future use.
Yeah. Very, very good. Yes, and you can see why it's so important, unfortunately, here.
Yeah, so instead of that type of stuff, after a bishop to g3, black can already take on g3 with a large advantage. Unfortunately, it got even worse. After knight e4, white's last chance is to actually take on d6. Instead, he played bishop d3, and now after knight takes g3, white is already losing a pawn with check, and this structure has been crippled. The e4 square is weak, and it's safe to say that black is just about winning already on move 10.
Yeah, I think it did get a little bit chaotic later in that game, but I think we felt that this was the most instructive moment, and since black did ultimately come up with the win, we thought it was all right to stop here.
Yeah, so another game that had a similar early conclusion was the game between Frank and Dave. Now, this game actually went back and forth, and lasted the full hour and a half, which was really interesting. But we see this really crazy b4 idea called the orangutan or Polish opening. And White's idea is to put this bishop on b2, get some pressure along the long diagonal, and try and do something useful with the b pawn later. We're not necessarily sure what it is. We might play a3 in some lines. We might push it to b5. And this e5 pawn is weak. So if black chooses to take on b4, white takes back on e5, and we're immediately hitting this g7 pawn.
Yeah, it turns out center pawns are better than b pawns.
A little bit. Yeah, so instead, black defends e5 with the knight, and now we see that b5 becomes a very strong idea. b5 would chase the knight away from the defense of the e5 pawn. White prepares that by playing e3 to take away this really nice d4 square, and now black makes a little bit of a lemon with g6. This just adds to the fire on this long diagonal, and white is in great shape after b5. The knight has to go to an awkward square on b4. White wins a clean pawn. He has not even given up this b pawn in exchange for the e pawn. Black's only move is f6. The bishop goes back, and now we see a very interesting moment, and I think it's a little bit instructive. This knight only has one square. It only has the d5 square. In the game, white played a3 and chased the knight. The knight went back to d5, and black was doing reasonably well, although it's safe to say that white is still winning after knight d5 up a pawn and better. However, c4 would close out the game right away. By taking away this square in advance, this is a common technique when fighting against knights. Take away their squares first and only then push them around. After c4, there's no good way to defend the knight, and a3 will come next and we'll be up an entire piece.
I love it. You know, I didn't even see this idea, which is why I was so excited. I had thought about playing something like queen f3 a little bit earlier with the same idea, but I see how c4 is just so much stronger because piece attacks inevitably allow things like queen f3, c6, and the knight can still come to d5. So we have to find this, which no protection is going to get through.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but it's the same idea, and in this case, queen f3 maybe hang c2. So we really have to play this precisely. But I think your point is extremely well taken. It's much better to chase around your opponent's worst piece, the knight on b4. So again, anytime we see these loose pieces, these pieces that are almost trapped, that becomes a critical moment, and we really do have to think about it and think hard and look for those wins.
Yeah.
Later on in the game, we actually got to a little bit of a crazy position here, and once again we see that the queen is putting some pressure on this bishop on c4. So already, because that's a loose piece, by playing knight f3 here, which is what white played, this bishop is now hanging, and anytime we're going to move a piece or have a loose piece in the position, you want to think long and hard about it. So here, immediately, black takes advantage and wins a piece, and black went on to get a completely winning position, completely winning endgame, and we see that in this position, up a pawn. Now, white can draw with best play here, to be sure. Unfortunately, it gets even worse for black. Black ran out of time in just a few moves and ended up losing the game, even though he was much better for most of the way.
It's so tough because we talk so much on this program and in previous weeks about using more of your time. We so rarely see a problem like this that to criticize someone for it feels completely out of the spirit. But I think it's important for Dave to look at earlier opportunities in this game where he could be more decisive, because far too much time was taken. When you're up a piece, there probably were opportunities there where you could play quickly, gather some time with the increment. Mm-hmm. I know that's something that you are very much a heavy practitioner of. You know how to do that really well. And collect the point, probably. I'm sure that there was an opportunity in time pressure and in a worse position for Frank to make a mistake here, but Dave just didn't put himself in a position to take advantage.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting game. I'd encourage everybody to take a look at it later, especially the endgame. There were a lot of moments when knights were hanging back and forth, and it was a fun back and forth game that we got to take a look at.
Yeah, I did hear from at least one of the players that he had a great time playing. So.
Good. Yeah,
that's very good.
Let's take a look at the game between Aaron and Bill.
Yes, thank you so much. So this was an interesting contest. We had a little bit of an unusual setup in a French defense where white eschewed I think, or eschewed. I always forget how to pronounce that word. But grabbing the full center with both hands and instead played this knight f3 line, which is perfectly good, right? He exchanged pawns, and now after d4, Bill went for this c5 move. Now, this is perfectly playable. It does commit early to an isolated queen's pawn position. So just to remind people quickly, right, this is a queen's pawn. If white takes here, you are going to have no e-pawn and no c-pawn, which means this pawn will have no natural defenders, and that will give you an endgame weakness. So it's a little bit committal, but it's definitely aggressive, and I don't mind it. However, there are some key ideas that it's worth knowing. Here, we were discussing this just a few minutes ago, we don't like bishop to e7. One of the major reasons for this is, although of course it's a perfectly sensible move, it does allow white to, at minimum, win a tempo by waiting and taking on c5 after you've moved. So it's probably worth it to bait this out a little bit and say, look, I can play knight to c6. I can certainly play bishop to g4. I'm a big fan of putting the bishop on that square. I think it's a little bit of annoying. It allows you to pressure the center more. These are some things we could have done to wait. So it's a tiny thing, but it might be worth looking at, especially in light of what happens. So in this moment, right, bishop to g5, so far both players played reasonably. I think Bill's got to do something to resolve this situation in the center. First of all...
Do you mean change the pawn structure?
Why, yes, I do! But that would be a critical moment! Oh, man. Okay, we got to get something for critical moments. We'll work on that for next time. Yeah, this is a really important moment in the game. Dare I say critical. If you take on d4... and you resolve things. Now, first of all, you don't give yourself an isolated queen's pawn, because after white tries to take back with, for example, the knight on f3, trying to avoid this, you can just take again. And now you get a structure that is...
technically, both sides have an isolated queen pawn, so this is kind of considered to be close to equal already.
Right, and not only do both sides have an isolated queen's pawn, but neither side can attack it very well because it's not on an open file.
Right.
So, yeah, this would sort of immediately diffuse any of white's advantage. I think black's very cozy. So that would have been the best way to play. I think it's probably also possible to do something like bishop to e6 here, maybe, but, you know, in light of what happened, it's probably good to resolve the situation in the center. So a6 is not to the purpose. I don't think we need to worry about this move, but it's also missing what white is planning. And white, we know Aaron's a good player. We know he can take advantage of little subtleties like this. He trades on f6 and then goes ahead and wins a pawn. This is legitimately dangerous. White can hang on to it a bit. b4 is a possibility in some lines. There's also probably some knight maneuvering here that's possible, but I won't get into it now. So black is already uncomfortable. Bill starts to, I think, try to be really aggressive as a way to gather momentum back, but I think it's not correct. He's got to develop his pieces. We can see that far too many of his queenside pieces are still sleeping, and after something like bishop e7, he's sort of wandering around a bit. He loses the h-pawn, and honestly, it's already just about sunk. We'll just look at it all the way through to the end, but the queen is getting bounced around, and after he tries to take on c5, I think probably trying to stay equal in the material race, but also maybe put the bishop on d6, threaten some checkmates, he runs into a nice fork, rook to d5, which not only picks up the bishop, but has lethal checkmate threats on h5. Just a gorgeous move, and it's an unhappy one to be on the receiving end of. But well played by Aaron.
Very
and better
fun
luck
game.
to Bill next time. Yes.
Yeah.
Continuing on.
All right, let's take a look at the game between Rob and Nick. This was another really well-played game by both sides. I think this might be the best game that we've seen from Nick so far in the two tournaments, so this was a fun game to look at. It started off with a normal-looking King's Indian type of structure. I don't love e6 so much. I think this does create some weaknesses on the dark squares. That was something that we saw a couple weeks ago from Nick as well. But after e3, I think it's a little bit justified. And the only way to really try and punish this would be to play bishop g5 and e4 and e5.
I made these exact comments earlier. I feel very gratified.
It's nice when we agree, isn't it?
Yeah.
So after e3, bishop g7, bishop e2, we get some normal developing moves. Bishop f3 is a creative way to put this on the long diagonal. And now Nick finds the very nice plan of c6, blunting that bishop, and he follows it up with d5, taking a large stake in the center. Now, with this pawn structure, black can either play for c5 or e5, kind of whichever one he chooses to play. After c5, Nick played a very, very nice move, b6. And the idea of b6 is we're going to undermine the structure for white. White would like to reinforce with b4, but now white hits with a5, and finally a3 cannot be played because this exchange would hang the entire rook on a1. If we want to do something like this, before we play b4, white has to prepare it with either a3 or bishop d2. These are all common ideas, sometimes in the Panov Botvinnik and the Caro-Kann, or out of a Nimzo Indian, but the long story is that black is doing very well already after b6. Perhaps the only move that's worth considering is capturing, trying to say that this c5 move has been slowed down a little bit and white can try and bail out with castling.
It's a tough move to play because it does help black quite obviously to open his a8 rook and activate his pieces, but I think maybe it's easier to make this instructive point seeing what happens in this game and how the center collapsing rips open the position for that bishop on g7.
Yeah, let's take a look at it. So after knight b6, Nick played the very strong move of taking on c5. Now he played knight a6. Once again, the only chance is probably to take. This is a really scary looking bishop. The b file is very weak, but I think white at least has some signs of life, and he can take a look and hope to attack the c6 pawn later. However, after castles, black quickly took on c5. This bishop has been opened. Black has two center pawns. It's safe to say that black has a large advantage. Nick immediately goes about taking advantage of that, putting the knight on e4, and after b4, the pressure was a little bit too much, and Rob hung a rook on a1. From here, the game was very routine for Nick, but he did close it out very nicely.
Yes, and I remembered as we were discussing it that this is our candidate for move of the week. So we are going to carry forward and take a look at it. I was very excited when I remembered this. So we're going to skip ahead because we do still have a lot of games to cover. But in this moment, so Nick does a very nice job here, something I want to specifically praise him for because I haven't seen it so much in earlier games, of activating his remaining pieces, right? When the attack does not seem to quite be getting home, he finds it's not my favorite of the two rooks to come to this square, but I like the overall plan that he plays d4, rips open the d file, and we can see immediately gets a wonderful payoff. He finds a very pretty, very nice move, rook to d1 check. This move is pretty specifically because white doesn't have to take for it to be good. Right? If white does play something like king e2, understanding what's coming, Nick can very easily play rook to e1 check, and the attack is going to continue. He's going to, at minimum, be able to trade this bishop for that one and keep on raging. So this would be an excellent move regardless. Unfortunately for Rob, he bit and played the obvious capture of knight takes d1, which allows immediately queen e1, check and mate. A nice job by Nick. I loved it.
And obviously Nick has seen the opera game if he's finding this pattern. It's a very nice idea.
Yeah, very, very good. I'm looking forward to seeing more of this quality.
Yes.
But carrying forward... Oh, yes, right. We had another effort. So this is between Killer Ted and Felix. Unfortunately, Killer Ted did not show up for this particular game. God bless him. We will get into it. So we have... sort of a Queen's Gambit, right, where black plays a Slav opening, a little bit of an unusual setup here. I'm more used to playing knight f6, but e6 is certainly playable. I'm going to carry forward out of the opening a little bit. I do not like this knight to b6 move. This seems a little bit strange to me. I'm not convinced that there are any really important squares over here at this moment, and I think black has got to finish his development and play normally. But really, the more interesting moments in this game are coming up in just a little bit. So, right here, right, Ted plays, I think, a good move of knight to e5, beginning a very typical idea, sort of a Pillsbury attack kind of setup. And as we see, Ted will execute in the game. His plan is to play f4 and really sink this knight into the e5 square such that taking it at any moment will open the f-file and create a very strong pawn on e5 and a lot of difficulties, a lot of kingside attacking chances. We got some interesting things going on in the chat right now.
Thank you, Nightbot. It's very aggressive of you.
You got to calm it down, Trist. I don't know what to tell you. You're getting too excited. We love it, but the chat doesn't. So this is a moment where Felix absolutely has to take on e5 right away. And a line that we concocted would be something like bishop takes e5. Yes, we do allow this strong pawn to e5, but after knight f to d7, even giving the h-pawn, the fact that black will have opportunities to regather, f4 is going to run into queen h4, so that is not a way that white can hold the pawn. Black has to be proactive against this threat. So the fact that he did not allows white to already get a commanding position, which he does manage to execute into a nearly winning kingside attack. The only thing we have to take a pause here to ding Ted just a little bit. Ted, the whole point of this is to set up the strong knight on e5. When you trade it for that lemon on d7, we don't like it, and we're going to point it out.
Not one bit. It's
You can't even try to be nice about it. You leave that knight there, Ted. You leave it there. All right, we'll move on. So, nonetheless, he does find a nice attack here. You see the kingside pawns are raging. Everything's opening up, right? He takes on g6. Killer Ted does lift up his head for a minute, and he sacks the bishop on g6. He starts coming in. Felix refuses the sacrifice. Ted says, I'm bursting through the door anyway. This is I think, probably the last moment I really want to look at in this game, which is here, I think you have to play queen to g6. You've got to continue to swarm in with your pieces and make threats. There's no immediate checkmate here, right, that I can find, but we have to find some kind of opportunity to create problems. I mean, now that I'm looking at it a little more closely, rook f7 is already creating massive lethal threats because we can play queen g8 or, of course, let's just pass turn quickly so I can get a look at this. If something like this is played, looky-loo, I got you. So queen g6 there is definitely the right move. Unfortunately, trading, even though the rooks aren't connected, so I can understand the logic, this just helps black get into the defense so much. Look at the awkwardness of this knight on d7 and how it crowds all the pieces. Suddenly, he's a rock star, preventing queen g6, and Ted, unfortunately, right after this, starts to lose the threat of the attack a little bit. He does make some nice moves. I love, obviously, these pawns on coming to e5. I do not like offering to trade the queens here, but I know we discussed at least you do have chances to press. Unfortunately for Ted, he just, after I think some reasonable moves, Felix found a nice tactic in the end game, and we'll just very quickly show it here. Ted, thinking that he can trade pieces by taking on f4, falls victim to a very nice discovery. So good heads-up play by Felix. Really, I think for Ted, the game was lost much earlier when he missed his opportunity to win.
Yeah, and I think this shows how impressive it is by Felix to stay in the game and keep fighting, even though he was much worse. And in fact, there was a moment when white could have forced checkmate in the middle game. So it just shows that if you stick around, good things happen.
Yeah, very good, very good.
Our next game is between Chip and Charlie, and if we jump back to the beginning of the game, we can...
It's usually where we like to start.
Exactly. We actually start out with a Benoni-type structure. It took a little bit of getting there, but after a while, we eventually get to this structure with c5, and white can play this d5 idea to really lock up the center and claim the lion's share of the center for all eternity. I think you could play d5 right here already. In fact, we had a few more moves, rook e1, a6. a6 is usually met by a4, a very automatic move in the Benoni. Now after queen c7, I don't like b3. There's no good reason to delay d5. This clamps down on the center. It slows down any e-pawn movement by black. And more importantly, when we play d5, we're opening up this bishop, and it would be really nice to have this b2 pawn defending the knight. Yeah. Other ideas that you'll see frequently are putting this bishop on some square and playing queen d2, kind of a similar idea to hold this knight. So there are a couple of things that are going on here.
Realizing just another minor theme this week is this dark squared bishop raging on that diagonal.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see that more in the game shortly. Rook e8, black is correctly recognizing that he has to move this e6 pawn and break it open the position that way. White does regroup and defend his knight, and now he plays bishop d3. I think instead of bishop d3, a better move might have been bishop b2, connecting rooks and taking advantage of the fact that he has played b3. After bishop d3, black continues with bishop b7, and I think this really invites the move d5 for white, and that is in fact what white played. Instead of bishop b7, perhaps it's better to take on d4 first. This is kind of the last opportunity to open the position, and after something normal like e takes d4, black is going to play for this e5 idea. So perhaps bishop b7 to connect rooks, and now after d5, we actually have tricks where we can take on d5, taking advantage of the not connected rooks.
Very cute, very cute. Yeah, I have to say, if I had to find one theme that I think unites a lot of our players from top to bottom, it's not always taking advantage of these opportunities, again, these critical moments, to change the pawn structure favorably for them.
Yeah, exactly. So if we take a look at a few more moves, after bishop b7, white did play d5, clamping down on this bishop and making it look a little bit silly. And now we see black play this typical idea of putting a knight on e5. The e5 square is weak for white. Now, after h3, I like h3 a lot because we're trying to trade off the knight and play f4. However, we'd like to play f4, but we can't because the rooks are not yet connected. If we try f4, black takes on d3, and now he plays this very good e6 break, which really has to happen. And after e4, the normal response, e4 fails tactically once again because the rooks are not connected.
And of course, knight takes fails just like we already looked at to bishop takes rook.
Yes, like the game that we looked at before between Rob and Nick. So in this case, white had to play bishop d2, and black took on d3, and now he has the chance to play e6. If black had played e6 here, I'd say that black is doing quite well, at least equal, maybe a little bit better. Instead of e6, once again, like e6, e4 really has to be played, but at least here we get to one of these positions where I think we can trade a pair of rooks and be okay. The typical plans would be something like queen d7, rook e8, and bishop c8 to kind of untangle a little bit. In the game, we had something that looks normal after queen f3. I don't like queen f3 at all because the idea is to play f4. The other thing that could happen here, we can play this mysterious rook move of rook b1. The idea is that we're preparing for all of these queenside breaks. If black plays b5, kind of no matter how black continues on the queen side, white will be well set up to deal with that. In the game, after queen f3...
Can I break in here for just
Please
a moment?
do.
Well, I had a really instructive moment. I think one of the first times I ever attended the U.S. Amateur Team East, which unfortunately is being conducted entirely online this year. So this is a team tournament that you and I both play on a team and have a great time every year. But one of the first times I participated, I remember, I can't even remember the player, but one of your friends who's an expert told me when people play attacking moves like this, queen f3, without the pawn behind it, you can just never be that scared of it. Without the benefit of the f-pawn pushing in, creating open lines for that queen, it's just not that scary, and I think that's something for Chip to be aware of next time.
Yeah, definitely. However, I think black kind of is a little bit complicit in this by playing f5 and creating some weaknesses right away.
Right.
However, f5 ended up working out very, very well. We had a few more moves, and black actually gets this nice attack on the queen, and he combines that with this nice attack on h3. So we see very quickly white moves the queen out of the way, f4 happens, so now we're not opening up the black king, instead we're really cramping the white pieces, and after just a few more moves, we see that this diagonal is already getting tender, g4 is a huge threat, and something like e5 probably had to be played. I think even though we're giving away a pawn for absolutely nothing, we are getting this e4 square, and this is almost enough to counteract the fact that we're sacrificing a pawn.
Yeah, I feel a lot better. I can certainly I can play bishop c3. I can get that dark squared bishop out of my life.
And no two ways about it, the white queen is very active, and there are some threats that black will have to deal with.
Sure, yeah, I see that too.
So after the game continuation, we just have a couple more moves that we want to look at. g4 really kind of hangs the house. After queen g3, h6, black's doing very, very well indeed. And after king h2, unfortunately, we just hang the queen to a quick tactic with the pin.
Suddenly occurs to me that we saw Charlie beat his brother Rob in the Bachelor Memorial this exact same way, with a bishop on e5. Maybe it was on d4, but still, this pin of the queen and king. Yeah, I think it was on d4, but still, he loves this idea. He executes it well.
Yeah.
Carrying forward, yeah, it is a little, it's tough. It's tough to see people go down that way, Trist. So, carrying forward, we had definitely a banner matchup this week between two undefeated players, that being Nate and Rufus. Both of these players have played some nice games so far in this tournament. We had a winnower French, so this is, well, actually, I'll carry forward a couple more moves. The central strategic idea of the winnower French is essentially this position here. Black has given up the bishop pair and given up significant potential for weaknesses on his king side in exchange for white having truly terrible pawns on the c-file, which black is able to attack. Frequently he does this with something like queen to a5. We see a little bit of a different idea out of Rufus in this particular game, but nonetheless, I think if you can remember that white will be trying to attack on the king side and often play for checkmate, and black will play for endgame advances on the queen side, that actually this game is extremely by the numbers. There's a lot to learn about this opening by watching this game. So I do not like this move knight f3 by Nate. I think he's almost certainly got to play queen to g4. That's a more typical idea to attack the king side. However, that's my personal opinion, as I do believe that knight to f3 has been played about 2,000 times. So Nate, don't at me. I know. Okay, so going on a little bit, right? We have some maneuvering by both players. I know that Nate is a theory hound. He may have prepared something here and playing into an interesting line. I do not like this c4 move by Rufus. I think this closes down a lot of his ability to play. We can certainly see that there's no more central tension. It's harder to access the c3 or c2 pawns. And white should probably be strategically winning here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the kingside attack is going to happen sooner or later. We're going to move the knight out of the way, play f4, play g4, play f5, and there's really nothing that black can do that's fast enough to deal with that. The queenside play is a little bit too slow, and after c4, you can't open the center to counterattack that wing attack the same way that you normally would.
Yeah, and I would also offer one more productive idea to Nate, especially since I see that he's in chat. Maybe I understand the temptation to put the bishop on g5 because you're thinking about developing your pieces, right? Which your coach yells at you to do. So I can't fault him too badly here. But I wonder if it might have been good to look instead, since there is this trade, at putting the bishop on a3. It's just as annoying. There's going to be a pin if black castles, and now we're better able to execute this plan. I'm not saying we play it right there, of course.
But maybe we do. I think the bishop is taking the best square away from the knight on g5, and the bishop on a3 is outside the pawn chain, so we can have ideas of bishop d6.
Yeah.
On g5, we're stopping f6, sure, but black doesn't really want to play f6 anymore. Without the dark square bishop, f6 loses a lot of its punch, and I would say that the bishop on g5 is just the wrong idea on this position.
Yeah, saying, oh, you have kingside attacking chances, let me open the kingside more for you, is probably not the kind of thing we expect Rufus to do.
Right.
So I do think that white was a little bit imprecise here, but honestly, the bigger mistake is what comes.
Yes.
He's got to take on b5 right now. Why? Well, for one thing, it's tactically sound. Black is going to be forced to recapture with a piece, which means he's not going to be able to recapture with a pawn and continue to put pressure or make trades or anything like that, open his rook, any of that good stuff, because of course there is a bit of a pin here. So that's the first thing that should alert you that this might be a good move. But the second one is even simpler, which is he's forced to do something, right? Of course, there is double pressure on this pawn, and once he pushes, and Nate, I know you know this because it happened to you, but this pawn ends up being very weak, and it's very difficult to defend. We can see the problem with these doubled pawns is not only that they're an endgame weakness, but also look at how they're impeding the progress of the white pieces over to the queen side. It's just hard to get over there. So black very calmly puts his knight on c6, and now the pawn's gone. I mean, I don't see an answer.
Nope.
So why does this matter so much? Well, to be honest, we're going to start cruising a little bit. So there were still opportunities. There were still opportunities from Nate to take over the game. He starts his typical attack a little late, but he does play the right ideas. I don't like this bishop h5 move. I think he's got to just go ahead and recapture. I know it's going to lead to some trades, but the problem is that bishop h5, he may not have expected this because it is what happened, basically allows Rufus to force the exchange of queens because there are just too many hanging pieces. Now you have to take no more kingside attack. As Alex Strapansky would tell us, no queens, no attack. Big fan of this. I say it all the time now. Nate does find a way to sort of cleverly trade the queens, right? At least he's able to get a pawn because, of course, queen takes h5 would run into some pretty nasty stuff. Yeah, so good. I do like that, making the best of a bad situation. But probably the only other moment worth mentioning is right around here. We have a really strange moment from two good players. I gotta be honest, I was a little surprised. There's a bit of a double blindness here. White has very good pressure suddenly on the d5 square, and if black plays something like rook to d8, it's basically over. And we go back to our earlier assessment. But Rufus gives Nate an opportunity by playing knight to d8. I'm not sure, right? He just seems to have failed to evaluate this. I think here you can take probably with either piece.
I think the bishop's better because
Yes.
we like the knight on d5 an awful lot.
Yes, I was about to say, especially with the opportunity to maybe come to f6, and there's all sorts of good squares out here. This is another good square. I'd rather have the knight in this position, especially since it's a light squared bishop. But Nate misses it too and takes on e6 instead, and unfortunately, this is probably where we go all the way to losing. The attack is over. We don't have enough pieces left to do any kingside attacks, and for those of you that are wondering why is this such a problem, let me just go ahead and cruise through the rest of this game for you. We just trade off another set of rooks. We push the pawn all the way down. White, understandably, goes over to regather it, but we suddenly start seeing that it's not so easy. Rufus finds knight to c6, so now you bring your king to b2. Fine, I know I'm losing this a pawn, I can pick off this pawn. And the rooks come off, the c pawn comes off, and although Nate did make Rufus prove it, which I approve of, Rufus did. The game ended in this position with d2 check to come.
Yes.
So well done by Rufus. I think some things to learn from by Nate, but the best thing to feel good about is you had chances to win this. Rufus has been a strong player in 2 tournaments, right? You absolutely had chances to take this.
That was a very interesting game, and I think it was really instructive. So I think as we're getting better collectively, we are getting some of these more instructive and more subtle games, which I really have enjoyed recently.
Yeah. Hey, Tristan, we don't tease people for their bad moves in here. We all make too many bad moves ourselves. Do not approve.
All right, so now we're getting to our game of the week, and this was between Alex and Greg. This was a very interesting game, and it was also a very back-and-forth game. And right out of the opening, we see that White mixes lines a little bit with knight f3. In the Alyakin defense, if we're playing c4, we usually want to also play f4, or we want to play some of these lines where we're taking back on e5 with the knight. Here, after knight f3, d6, black is not compelled to take on e5, so white doesn't get the opportunity to take back on e5 with the knight the same way that he would in perhaps a 4-pawns attack with f4 here. Yeah. So I think just something to be aware of, but this does let black equalize basically right away.
Yeah, Alex, I think if you want to play this way, I'm a huge fan of just playing with e4 and d4, e5 and d4, and just playing classically. I reserve c4 a little bit.
You can leave the c-pawn back here, maybe c3.
Yeah, you get a much more stable position.
Yes. So Greg correctly responds with bishop g4, pinning this knight, threatening right away to trade it off. And after h3, we have the opportunity to do that. Black could absolutely take on e5, and get this structure, which is already really, really nice for black.
Hang on. Don't we have queen takes b7 there, or is that not a problem?
It's an idea, and this is something that you might see from time to time, but this is a poison pawn. And with the c4 pawn, we don't have this bishop b5 idea, so black gets some very quick development. There's knight c5 at the appropriate moment, and you'll actually see that this c4 pawn gets a little bit weak after things like queen h4. So this is an idea that you might see from time to time, but the idea actually works a few moves later because of the way the game goes. And here after e6 and bishop e2, we actually see that we can do the same exact thing again, and in fact black could trade queens right away and get this really nice position with the rook in the center of the board.
Yeah, that would be good stuff. I just have to say, I'm so used to these bishop e2 lines in response to the pin, and when the bishop comes to f3, this is almost always good to take on b7. So that's an instructive point for me that the queen taking is not nearly so special.
Yes.
Carrying forward.
And the way that the game actually went, Greg played bishop b4 check, and I like that as well. I think that forces White to make some concession. White chooses to put the knight on a more passive square. The knight would really like to go to c3, but on c3, we're already losing this e5 pawn because we're blocking the bishop's defense of it due to this pin. So after knight d2, a little bit of a concession, and now Greg plays the extremely active queen d3, putting that queen in the center of the board, really a scary square for it. Now we have a few more moves, queen e2. Perhaps black could even keep the queens on with something like queen c2. Shortly, the rook will be coming over to the d file, and something... We're attacking the bishop, something so simple. White would like to defend that with rook b1, but oh yeah, the rook's loose because this knight is pinned.
Oh yeah.
So queen c2 might have been a fun way to continue. Instead, black traded queens, and now after we take on d2, perhaps the last moment for black would be to castle, connect to rooks, and I think black is still doing quite well here, but already we have this permanent advantage of the bishop pair against the rooks. So again, talking about critical moments, anytime you're trading queens going into that endgame, you really have to think about the position. The bishop pair is extremely strong, especially in the endgame. White can open up the position at his leisure. He can push the f-pawn, he can push the c-pawn, he can push the a-pawn, and he'll have these opportunities anytime he wants. Unless these knights are extremely active, white's going to be better and perhaps winning right away.
Yeah, and let me just go ahead and say, if you take a look at that knight on b6, they're not extremely active.
No, not so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when white can take on c6 and double the pawns. I think it's very safe to say that white is much better already.
Yeah, I think the one of the rules of thumb that I have always been taught and is extremely useful is when you're at this moment of queen exchange, just going back a hair, ask yourself whose king is more safe. And although neither king is castled, I think it's pretty clear because of the positioning of the black pieces that it is white's monarch that has something to worry about. He cannot, for example, after queen c2, castle to either side. Obviously, queen side is illegal, and king side hangs multiple pieces. I mean, you could take on d2, you could take on b2, you could take wherever you like.
Yep.
So ask yourself whose king is less safe. If the answer is your opponent's, don't trade the queens.
Yes, that's a really good way to think about it. The other way to think about it that I like is after the queens have come off, ask yourself who's better in the endgame. That's kind of what we want from these critical moments. And this is a little bit hard to evaluate, to be sure. But I think if you start to think about it and start to see a lot of these positions, you see that the king on e2 is an asset, not a liability, and the bishop pair is a huge asset for white. And I think those two factors are really going to contribute to say, maybe we should keep the queens on.
I like that. I feel like mine was like for Class D players and yours was for Class BA players, right?
We can think about it a couple of ways, and we come to the same conclusion.
Very much so.
All right, so after the game continues, we see that this king is a little bit hard to deal with. It's hard to get this h-rook active, and white... or black decides to castle to activate the rook, but now the king is very far away from the center, and in an endgame we do want to activate the kings. White goes about trading off all of the rooks, and now we just see the bishop pair dominating the knight pair.
Why did we get rid of the rooks?
I think we have to in this case. Anytime there's an open file, the rooks get traded down open files. White controls the open file, but here I think I would still consider rook c8, just keeping the rook on at all costs and trying to make a draw this way.
Yeah.
Now maybe I can walk the king over. Perhaps I can play knight d7 someday. And it's not pleasant, but at least if these minor pieces get traded off, the bishop doesn't have so much scope. So I'd be able to hang on and perhaps play for a draw this way.
Yeah, that's definitely the bishop I would like to see leave the board. Because this e5... More on the c5 pawn later. The c5 pawn definitely impedes the progress of the dark squared number.
Yeah, let's take a look at the game because I think you're exactly right. We see some interesting stuff later on. Now, I don't love b4 so much. When you have this dominating position with the two bishops against the two knights, the most important thing is to choke out every move from black. Take away all of those squares from the knights. So to that end, bishop d4. We see that if this knight is 2 squares away from the bishop is controlling all of the active squares that knight can move to. Sure, black can play c5. I'm quite happy to drop my knight back, and we've just created another weakness. This bishop has a lot of scope. If b6 is ever played, this bishop can perhaps come into c6. I'll be able to play a5 at some moment, and it's just going to be a long, slow grind, and black really doesn't have anything active to do, and white can take his time and really try and control the game and control every square in the position. That said, b4 is certainly not a bad move. The only downside is that after knight to b6, white is gambiting a pawn. White chooses to give up the a-pawn, the correct pawn to give up. The bishops are going to do quite well controlling this a-pawn. It's never going to become a passed pawn. Already we see that this knight is running low on squares. After knight b6, I like b5 a lot. It coordinates extremely well with this bishop to slow down c6. The A pawn really doesn't want to move because this knight on b6 gets loose, and we see that black is reduced to shuffling the king around and really can't do much that's active.
Never a great sign.
Yes. Bishop e2 is a little bit of a mysterious move, but we quickly see that the plan is to push that f-pawn. Pushing that f-pawn, especially in conjunction with pushing the g-pawn, and white is going to try and crash through and take advantage of the more active minor pieces.
Yeah, can we take another second here, because I feel like we see so little of this?
Sure.
Greg offers c6, and Alex, just like we talk about so often, keeps the tension. He says,
Yep.
So what? If you take, I'm much happier to have my pawn on b5 controlling your knight than taking just because I feel like I have to.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that the best plan for black is to take, and that is what happened in the game, trying desperately to make a passed pawn for some counterplay. But after knight d5, we see that this knight, while it looks good on d5, we can control it well with the king, and the only square this knight can go to is b4. And on b4, well, we have this nice bishop c5 fork, and we would pick off the knight right away. In fact, after king e4, we're threatening to pick off a7 as well. So black defends that with b6. However, now the extra pawn is crippled. It's backwards forever. It's never running up the board, and I'd say that white has all the chances in the world to play a very nice endgame here. After bishop c4, we're threatening to take and win a pawn, and this endgame, after we trade this way, would be in fact winning for white. Again, because of the active bishop, we can play one of these pawn breaks at our leisure, and white will be able to choose one to do that based on where this knight goes. In fact, black recognized that and played knight c7, putting a little bit of pressure on b5, but again, we see that this bishop 2 squares away really controls all of the knight's squares. It's a really nice pattern to know. F5 is played, pushing this pawn, and after knight b7, we see f6, and this is black's last chance to save the game. In the game, black took, and this allows a 3-on-2 majority, and this will lead to a passed pawn sooner or later. Yes, we're giving black this passed e-pawn, but that doesn't make any difference. The only thing that matters is that white is getting a passed pawn. The bishops can control both sides of the board at the same time, so this is enough for white to take home the full point.
Now, we've obviously discussed the fact several times already that the two bishops are great, but something else you want to think about, since two bishops so easily become one bishop, as I think they do in this game, one of the sets of minors are traded off. One of the things to think about when you're trying to evaluate that endgame is, are there pawns on both sides of the board? Because if you have pawns only on one side, now the knight's color complex advantage, the fact that he changes color on every turn, for example, might give him a little bit of an edge over the bishop, and you might not be in as much trouble as normal. But when it's on both sides of the board and you really are looking to stretch the defense, as we would talk about in football, you definitely want your fast pieces on the board. The bishops are 100% going to have the advantage.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. So in this position, because of all the things that John just mentioned, black's only chance is to play king to f8. The idea is that if white takes on g7, which sooner or later he'll take on g7, this bishop on d4 is restricted by this pawn. Now black's going to sit here forever and do nothing, but it's okay to do nothing if you're just trying to make a draw and not lose.
And Greg's an actor. He's used to doing nothing.
But we joke. I'm sorry, what did you do for a living? All right, moving right along. After f6, we do see that white gets these 3-on-2 majority, and he quickly takes advantage of that. We're threatening to take off an entire knight, so black has to deal with that right away. The knight goes back to an extremely passive square, and now g5 comes. We're starting to push those pawns. After knight to d7, I like dropping this bishop back, keeping all of the pieces on the board. Black correctly trades a pair of pawns. The only way that he can make a draw is by trading off all of these pawns. And he does still have an extra pawn, so he might still have some drawing chances if he can trade. But now we see that he already doesn't have any good moves. King g8, the idea is to swing the knight around to g6 and try and hold that way. White quickly plays bishop d3 so that if the knight does show up on g6, we can simply capture it, and then we would be able to take off all of black's pawns with the other bishop that's remaining. Black, in desperation, gives up a pawn to trade off a bishop, and now we see this moment here. I like bishop c4 yet again, once again setting up this domination of the knight, but I think that Alex had seen this really nice idea after king d6. Even though the knight can come to e6, now we see this really nice pattern. g6 is played. Of course, we cannot take because we would lose the entire knight. And after the move played in the game, knight to c5, instead of moving the bishop, Alex plays our move of the week, king to e7.
Wait. We already had a move of the week.
We had a move of the week candidate, but we decided to give that to our game of the week. This is a really nice move to finish off the game.
Election week controversy.
We counted all the votes, and king e7 came up as the legal winner of move of the week.
Yes, absolutely. Here we are, and we're very happy to greet our move of the week elect.
So black did struggle with f takes g6, and now f7 was played, and we're making a brand new queen, and bishop takes g6 is just the icing on the cake, chasing that king even further away, and in just a few more moves we forked the knight and the king, and we had resignation from Greg.
Yeah. I think Greg here was hanging on only because the knight is so tricksy, and certainly after king to g5, if white was just way too greedy for the win and took on b6, I am quite sure Greg was planning to play knight d5 and save himself. But Alex has shown himself capable of much more solid play than that, and he simply made a few maneuvers until he was the one playing the winning fork.
Very nice. So let's take another quick look at the standings. I think we are really going to be looking forward to that game between Alex and Rufus. We've just seen that they both can play extremely well. And even though they played well, there were certainly chances for their opponents. So we'll look forward to that game, and we'll keep you posted on when that game's scheduled.
Yeah. I think we do have one more game. Actually, should we take a quick peek here just to see if this game is over? Maybe, yes, okay. So we did have our final game of the week that we were not able to cover because of when it was scheduled. So we'll just throw that up very quickly. We're not going to try and analyze this too much since we are...
Neither one of us have actually seen this game yet, but it looks like it was yet another back and forth game. It looks like a pretty normal London position, but black has developed this bishop, which looks pretty nice. So I'd say it's probably roughly equal already on move 6. I don't know about a3 and bishop d6, maybe you take on d2 here and go for that type of structure. But here, after knight f3, I'd say that black is doing quite well after potentially taking on f4. And I think that's actually what we got. So again, this is all just kind of off the cuff, but we see that this isolated d-pawn is giving black sufficient chances to play.
Yeah, some of that compensation that we were talking about earlier, where now we're really controlling e5, is mitigated because the d file's open, right? That seems to be creating
usually there's a pawn on c3 in some of these positions.
Right, and so we have a boulder on d4, and so we have all this advantage. But here, maybe our control of e5 is not compensated for because of this.
It's an isolated queen pawn. No two ways about it. You do have to deal with the structural weaknesses there. Anyways, let's make a few more moves and see what happens. So again, all normal development. Looks like we have this knight a5 idea again. White saw that, got out of the way with queen d3. Perhaps bishop b5 is a little bit better, trying to take advantage of this loose knight. And if something like knight to a5, we can move the queen somewhere and try and play against this backwards pawn. So just spitballing, though. After rook to e8, I think that probably white can move this knight and try and take over the center. It looks like the idea of bishop b5 would now pin the knight. So perhaps this was the last opportunity to move this knight and avoid all of those pins and free up the c-pawn to run forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe that bishop b5 move is even more accurate than knight e5 right away, so that we can't get it traded off.
Yeah, so here after knight takes e5, I like d takes e5. I don't know about bishop h3. I think it looks flashy, but I'm not sure we're actually threatening anything concrete. I want to put this rook on the e file or the d file anyways. I'd probably play rook d1 personally, but I think rook e1 is also fine.
Yeah, I like rook d1, just although it is a little bit awkward, but I want to tactically protect my queen just in the event of that bishop moving away. I don't really want to hang out there with a loose queen.
Yeah, I don't like taking on d5 with the bishop. When there's a bishop on h3 and we have these light square holes, I think it's very important to keep this bishop on the board.
Yeah.
Something like knight e4 and rook d1 would make a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't take with a queen there if I was Chris playing black.
And he did not.
Nah, very good, Chris.
Yeah.
I like it.
All right, so let's. I think already we have a chance to play Queen D7 and start to come in on the light squares. That might be a good way to play, and might be a chance for Black to play C5 and D4, and maybe put the queen on a different diagonal.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that a lot.
All right, so a couple more quick moves. It looks like we try and get on this diagonal a different way. C5 looks almost forced, and that is what happens. Knight B5 makes a lot of sense. Perhaps rook to E7. Okay, rook D7 also fine. G4 is cute. It looks like that bishop's almost trapped.
Ooh, something could
I
be
think we
on
have
here.
to play H5 to try and get out.
Try and make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Okay, C4, D4.
Ooh, I don't like C4. That seems to shut down all your possibilities for play.
Yeah, I agree. This pawn's never getting out of the way, and probably we have knight d6, and after knight d6 we can't take because the rooks are connected, so this rook is not hanging, and now white could simply march the king up and take the bishop off the board.
Oof.
All right, let's make a few more moves. Yeah, here again I think we should trade, and we see exactly that, and it looks like white is in fact winning that bishop. Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice game, and it looks like white did in fact go on to win, so this was a really nice game.
That's very interesting. That's good. Yeah. Let this be a notice that if you schedule your game during the roundup, there is no guarantee that we will cover it. We were being generous this evening, as we did finish the show in good time. But try and get all your games in, please, this week before the roundup, so that we can have a little bit more time and get to have the
and
show.
We can even announce the pairings for the next week, other than just the top one board that we're all going to be looking forward to.
That is true. Yeah, two players knew who they were playing since this afternoon. But so thank you all so much. Another fabulous week. I'm really looking forward to the next one. Andrew, thank you as always for your insightful commentary. And we will see you next time. Thank you once again for watching Acceptable Chess.